4 teams left. Lions, the top seed, they are out in the NFC. Lions will be without Ben Johnson moving forward. Bears get there. Man, we've got a lot to talk about here on the SumerSports Show today. Lindsay Rhodes with Sam Bruchhaus. Sam, this is the Rhodes to the Championship podcast episode. I guess we're talking about championships right and left these days. I didn't watch a single second of the college championship game last night. I know we can get into why, but I know that you sure did. What were your general thoughts now that the college football season's wrapped up?
I think the college game's in an interesting place because you have a team like Notre Dame who has a young up-and-coming coach, and they're building the old school way. A lot of those guys, sans the quarterback, Riley Leonard, of course, came in as recruits. And that seems to be the way that Marcus Freeman wants to build his team. And he's a charismatic leader and a guy who has overperformed as compared to expectations. That was a place that Brian Kelly said you couldn't really even get to the championship, much less win the championship, when he left for LSU. And then you look at an Ohio State team that spent $20 million on their roster. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I think there is competitiveness that is added in by the new NIL era, but there's also the big dogs like Ohio State and Michigan that not only have the historic precedent of winning all the time, but also have the money to do it. So it's an interesting spot. It was a good game as a Notre Dame alum. You know, I wish it would have gone a little bit different, but I did like what I saw from the Irish. And I think Ohio State just has an excellent team and that those wide receivers for Ohio State have a big future in the NFL.
Is it weird that maybe the most memorable single moment from the game will be that one girl crashing the golf cart in the hallway after the game? Like, what?
Look, I mean, maybe I'm a football purist. I think the most memorable point of the game was the first drive where they ran Riley Leonard 10 times, and Sean Syed and a couple other people are texting me like, you were built for this, loving running quarterbacks and loving running them into the ground. And I was like, hey, it's the championship. It's time to run them into the ground, baby. There's no better time. But, you know,
what are you saving them for?
Yeah, I'd rather lose my quarterback, I guess, on designed rushes than by golf cart accident after the game. Certainly.
That poor girl. I just felt so bad for her because it was everywhere afterward. And I was like, this is her moment. Like, this is everyone's going to be like, who is that girl? Why did you?
She should start a podcast. She should take advantage of it. Sell t-shirts.
She should. What should she call it? I mean, she's going to need to come up with some interesting branding.
The Hitting the Wall podcast.
Hitting the wall. Oh my God. Oh, Sam. So you do a draft podcast for SumerSports also, right? Draft FM. Really quickly, since we are already talking college, before we get into the 4 teams that are moving on to the championship round and the 4 that were eliminated in the divisional round from an NFL standpoint, as we turn the page to draft season, what are the overarching themes that you think need to be on people's radar? You know, people like me that are not hardcore into college following all season long, like bullet point it for me, what we need to know about this draft class.
So the first thing, which has been the discussion that I think the people greater will know, is the quarterback class is not that great. There's real qualms, there's real concerns about Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward, primarily based around decision-making, sack avoidance, stuff like that. Last year, the sack avoidant quarterbacks were Michael Penix, who was pretty much excellent across the board, but a little older, Bo Nix as well. And then the guys who we did have concerns about with sack avoidance were Caleb Williams and Jane Daniels, who were 2 of the most dynamic quarterbacks we've ever seen with their legs, whether that's, behind the line of scrimmage trying to play make in the passing game, or in the case of Jane Daniels, which we saw this week in the running game as well. I think that's the first note. The second note, which I think we're going to highlight as we talk about the Lions, is this edge class is really, really good and really, really deep. And so we're looking at guys like Abdul Carter, who frankly could, depending on how the draft goes, could get into that 1, 2, 3 range despite only playing edge rusher for 1 year. We're looking at guys like Michael Williams from Georgia. We're all the way down to, there's probably going to be a player from Central Arkansas who is drafted in the 1st or 2nd round, from Marshall in the 1st or 2nd round. It's really, really deep, and I'm really excited to see some of these edge rushers play at the Senior and Shrine Bowl, because I think it's going to be very important. So there's going to be a lot of premium non-quarterback players taken, primarily probably on defense. Will Johnson's another guy, cornerback position, Travis Hunter obviously as well. But that's, I think, going to be the story of day 1 and day 2 of the draft as we continue into the combine and past that.
You mentioned the Lions. Obviously, they're going to be filling some voids, not just on the roster, but in the coaching ranks. Ben Johnson having taken that job in Chicago, as I think a lot of people expected all season long. There was a late push for the Raiders, at least narratively speaking, a lot of stories about them making a late run at him, but he ends up choosing the Bears. We'll talk in just a bit about that kind of fit, what it means for Chicago, what the loss of him specifically means for Detroit. By the way, Aaron Glenn has been called back for a second interview with the Jets. There are reports that that's the only second interview that they're doing at the coaching position. Whether that turns out to be true or not remains to be seen, but certainly an indication of some serious interest there. So we can get into that also. That fit, a defensive coach, I think, for the Jets is kind of interesting, given the options. But I want to start with the games that we saw over the weekend. And I think it's the weather kind of came up for me, the Sunday games in particular. And I know that they're built in. I know that like that is just something that kind of goes with the territory. And I almost think positively. Like my husband and I actually were talking about whether or not, he was like, it's a bummer that they're not in domes. And so we're just not getting a chance to see, like, once it gets to this point in the season, the best football teams, you know, like the Super Bowl teams primarily, or the Super Bowls are played in areas where the weather can't really affect the game. And so there's a benefit to that approach in that game. But on the build up to it, I'm kind of the mind that everybody knows that this is a thing. And so it's an interesting twist that you have to build a team that can not only get to the playoffs, but then can also compete in the playoffs in an environment that might involve some outdoor games in January that are going to be impacted by weather. I kind of like the idea and that twist that you have to account for both, really, in terms of your roster build. But certainly it seemed like it affected the games in a way where we didn't get a chance to see the best that the teams had to bring to the table. And in that sense, it's kind of a bummer.
Yeah, I think to your point about roster building, I actually think all 4 teams that did play performed variably well, given that all teams were designed to both win through the running and passing game. They were pretty much all designed around quality defensive line play and linebacker play and stuff like that. And we pretty much saw them do it. The questions about weather come in when it's like, what is just variance? What's just, you know, the human body can only take so much. And on any given play, one person, you know, their hands might not work. That happened to me all the time when I played in the cold. And when you see fumbles and inaccurate passes from folks that just do it all the time, how much can you really pin that on them, particularly when you're in Buffalo, which is windy and next to the Great Lakes? And there's, it turns into golf kind of at that point, would be my comparison, where, you know, at any given point in time, the winds can change, I guess. And I think that was a little bit disappointing, because it did feel like some of the fumbles and interceptions across the games that were outside were kind of fluky to a certain degree, mostly because we saw a bunch of good play, particularly from Lamar Jackson outside of the turnovers. And so as someone who believes that championships are won in the rain and the snow and the bad weather, and as someone who understands that you just got to play through it all the time, it did suck, because these games, whether they were in a dome, whether they were in, you know, Boca Raton or in the North Pole, they were going to be very thin margin games. And it felt kind of like the thin margins were caused pretty distinctly by the weather.
Yeah. And by the way, fully acknowledging on my end that that is an advantage that people fight for. And if you are a team that has that kind of outdoor advantage built into your home field, then, you know, that's something that you earned during the regular season with the seed that you ended up getting. So, I mean, there's that to keep in mind. But it's, you said from your experience, you know this, I talked to so many football players over the years about playing in those cold weather games and how it impacts you, like as a receiver. I remember receivers talking about how, it's so there's such a mental component because every time you catch the ball, it feels like your hands might have shattered. Like
Right.
I remember people telling me jokingly that they would like look down at their hands afterwards to make sure that they were still there because it just feels like they're rock hard. And then you catch that ball. And so it's painful, like things that normally aren't painful that are just part of the game are extra things that you have to think about and deal with. And maybe that's why, sometimes you've got a receiver and the catch isn't made, maybe in the case of Mark Andrews. I'm bummed that we haven't heard from him yet. Because I know that there's another layer there where I personally think it sucks that so many people on social media go to the places that they go to, particularly on one social media site where everything is so hyper negative. And obviously Mark Andrews got a lot of negative feedback. There are also a lot of people out there that are reasonable, that understand that, he did his best. He's consistently good for the Ravens and it is what it is. But I do wish that he had stood at the locker afterward, just kind of answered the questions and in their post availability this week. I think it was earlier today that he also didn't talk. Anyway, so the Ravens are eliminated in a weather game. The Rams are eliminated in a weather game. The Texans are eliminated on Saturday to the Chiefs, and the Lions are also eliminated. So we've got 4 teams that took an early exit. Well, not an early exit, but exited earlier than they would have liked. The Ravens and Bills we were already talking about there. So you talked about the margins. What do you think ultimately was the deciding factor in that game?
Turnovers. And frankly, it didn't seem like it by the end of the game, but for the Lions, that was the difference as well. And you just have to get to the point where you limit turnovers. And Lamar had a bad throw and they took advantage of it. And then 2 fumbles are it's hard to win games when you're turning the ball over 3 times, and down from Pee Wee football all the way to the NFL. That's the case. We cannot ding Lamar Jackson outside of the turnovers for his play, though. I mean, you look across the spectrum of analytics, and there's some interesting items like our tracking metrics didn't really think he was the most accurate ever. Again, is that chalked up to the weather? But he was making great decisions and he was on time all game. You look at all-in-one metrics, we thought that he was pretty solidly in the top third of the performances that we've seen. You look at QBR, he's nearing, the 90th percentile. The dude had a great game and the dude put the team on his back. The only reason they were in a point of view where it did come down to a 2-point conversion and it did come down to a Mark Andrews drop is because the stars on the Baltimore Ravens played so well. Derrick Henry, also excellent game. The offensive line, excellent game. It was just a true battle between probably 2 of the 3 best teams in the league right now. And, it's a shame that it comes down to the weather, and it's a shame that it comes down to such a pinpoint moment with the drop. But that's how it breaks, and that's why this is going to be a memorable game between the 2 top MVP candidates.
It was an interesting couple of halves in terms of the Bills' defense and their ability to contain Derrick Henry. Like in the first half,
right?
Very much so. In the second half, less so. And at the end of the day, he has a pretty solid line there with 84 yards and 5.3 yards per attempt. And but in the first half, it felt like he really, really had a hard time getting going, and then maybe just wore them down as the game went on. I feel like I don't know where you come in on this conversation, because I feel like we tend to focus always on whatever that last play is, particularly if it didn't happen, right? Like positively, okay, great. Somebody makes a great catch, like give them all the love. That's fine. But when people put all the blame on a play late that doesn't happen, my brain just doesn't work like that. And I have such a hard time going, what about all of the other ones during the game that also could have ultimately been the difference, but weren't in that moment, that had so much pressure attached to it and all of the attention. Like it's the age old kicker thing, right? Where the kicker misses the kick at the end of the game. And some people are like, it's the kicker's fault. And I'm like, all of these other things. So I suppose it depends on how how you look at the whole game, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe whether you're a black-white type of person anyway, rather than gray. But I just have such a hard time looking at that type of a game and going, oh, Mark Andrews. Anyway.
I think because football is a game where there's so much going on at once, people assume that the individual success rate on people doing their jobs, per se, or their assignment on any given play is very high, and it could not be further from the truth. Like, you're lucky on any given defensive play if there is not a major breakdown. And on the flip side, you're lucky that you can take advantage of those major breakdowns on any given play, because it's the same way, particularly across the offensive line on the offensive side of the ball. And so I think when we watch these games, and sure, a pitch and catch play between Lamar Jackson and Andrews probably is a 70%, 80% chance of being successful. But it's not the layup or the alley-oop that you would see in basketball. It's not jumping up and just laying it in. There's a lot of stuff that had to go into that for it to get to that point. And then there's a lot of things that had to happen individually on that play. And so I tend to agree with you. There's certainly focus points that you always want to check in on: turnovers, as I highlighted, and then kind of full game performance. Like, I don't think Roquan Smith played really well in this game. They really struggled against this Bills running attack that has been good and has been a three-headed monster, plus Josh Allen all year. But I think you have to peel the onion back a little bit to see what was really going on and why they were in that position for the game.
We'll talk about the Bills moving forward as we take a look at their matchup against the Chiefs. But first, let's put a button on the Ravens and their season, and what you maybe, when you zoom out, once they've had a chance to metabolize the fact that it's over, and try to put the pieces back together maybe in a different way for next season. Where would you think about starting if you're the Baltimore Ravens in terms of ways that you can make them even better than they were this year? Because they were really freaking good this year, right? Like, I mean, particularly when you look on the offensive side of the ball. The best EPA per play offense, the passing offense, obviously Lamar, Derrick Henry, all of these different things. Maybe we could add some different components to the passing game in terms of the pass catchers. Certainly, I think defense is probably where your mind goes first.
The thing down the stretch, though, is the defense ended up being really good.
Yeah.
And they have Madubuike on that defensive line. Nate Wiggins at the cornerback position ended up playing very well. Marlon Humphrey, their kind of stalwart guy, also played well. And then of course, Kyle Hamilton at the safety position played well. So I think they figured some stuff out, and they're not going to be in a position where they're going to have to switch defenses as they did with Mike McDonald heading out to Seattle and Orr coming in as a defense coordinator. It seemed as if there was a little waiting period there until the middle of the season. It was clear to me that they were trying to figure out the wide receiver problem throughout the year. They went ahead and tried to get Deontay Johnson and did play him snaps, even though he didn't get targets. And then that kind of blew up in a way. I think they're probably a little bit more focused on that than I'd expect. I think, you do try to maybe backstop the running back position as well, given that Derrick Henry's getting older, but I think that's a match made in heaven.
He's gonna be good
for Lamar.
forever, Sam. Yeah. Have we not learned? Like, every year we do maybe this next year's the year. It's never gonna be the year. He's gonna play till he's 80.
Right. But I think they are probably a little bit more focused than the public general is on the wide receiver position. And I also think it's a very interesting thing because the two of the best teams in the league are going to be really focused on the edge position, I think, as well, where they didn't have, the apex guy this year. Van Noy played well, and then last year Jadeveon Clowney also played well, but it's been more of a stopgap for them. I think if they really want to take it to the next level, they try to take advantage of that edge depth in this draft and probably focus there as well.
So we're going to see some edge picks there late in the first round, unless some of these teams move up. With these teams probably that are eliminated in this range, you think?
We'll see. It'll be interesting at the combine because I think there's a chance that a bunch of these guys are gonna, start flying up, and there may be a mid-round run on edges, which we didn't necessarily see last draft, but we have seen before with some of these guys. And particularly given that a lot of people are high on a lot of G5 and FCS guys, as I mentioned. Those are guys that when they get invited to the combine, if they put on a show, all of a sudden you go from, oh, I've never watched this film, I don't want to watch this guy against Troy, to I got to watch this guy immediately because he's an athletic freak. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
By the way, so you mentioned how the Baltimore defense had really come on much stronger at the end of the season. From week 14 on, including the last 2 weeks in the postseason, obviously, number 1 in dropback EPA against, which is wild considering that was essentially the weakness that everybody highlighted, right? Was like in the passing game, you knew you could throw on them. Number 2 overall in EPA per play. They had the lowest success rate against. You're right. That's wild. That's a wild turnaround. I do think a lot of it probably did have to do with losing the defensive coordinator and just having to kind of sort of rebuild from within, and that just taking a beat at the beginning of the season. But you make some really good points. I do think it's also worth mentioning, and you mentioned his name, Kyle Van Noy, the fact that Kyle Van Noy played as well as he did this year. I think maybe a couple of years after, people started thinking like, maybe we're done with Kyle Van Noy, like, in the way that at least as far as him being the player that he once was. And that turned out to be so incredibly incorrect. Good for him.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what they do too, because they do have a couple of key offensive linemen that are unrestricted free agents, Stanley, Patrick McQuarrie. So basically, in essence, they could be trying to replace the left side of their line, but I'd be pretty shocked if they aren't able to work something out there. Especially given that this offensive line ended up being one of the better ones in the league this year. Probably want to keep that together a little bit, but they did replace the full right side of the line this year. Maybe they track that over to the left. Maybe that's what they're looking for in the draft. They're kind of out of the range of the Will Campbells and the Kelvin Banks. It'll be interesting to see what they do with their offensive line as well. A couple questions for them, but I don't think it's the most key issues for them moving into the offseason.
What about the other AFC team to be eliminated? Houston, which felt kind of like the outlier of this final 8 in the sense that they weren't, I guess they had the biggest kind of hole. If you were just looking at different units and where the weakness was, it felt like the Houston offense was, the biggest outlier of this group. I guess you could maybe say Washington's defense to a degree too, but not as much as Houston's offense. I feel like all of the other offenses that were here were pretty strong. And then there was Houston. Their defense obviously was very, very good. They feel like a team that has a lot of the pieces though to be better next year. They just didn't have them this year because of various injuries. I would maybe want to take a look at that offensive line. I'd much prefer for CJ Stroud to not be under duress quite so frequently.
Yeah, I mean, this Chiefs game lined up exactly what their problem was all year. It was CJ and Nico and a little bit of Joe Mixon versus the world, practically. Laramie Tunsil was really good this year, but he's more of an island player. He was good in the run and pass game. He did, in particular, have a lot of false starts, strangely, this year. I don't think that's going to be something that tracks. But altogether, this Texans team, it feels like that's the last piece. And I feel like this was just a little bit of a sophomore slump. I liked how CJ played against the Chiefs. He was back to kind of his old stuff where you were seeing him make accurate throws and moreover, accurate, difficult throws. And that's what you want to see from him in the playoffs. And I think that's going to carry over in next year. I think the Texans are just, a few drops away from being very good. And it's almost certainly across that offensive line. Their defense is young. You got guys like Will Anderson. You got guys like Sting. And those are just tentpole players that are going to be there for years and years and years, particularly with a defensive-minded head coach. Fix up the offensive line, maybe, retool the way you're calling the offense as well. There was a lot of running that was happening on first and second down throughout the year that I didn't really love from Bobby Slovic. Maybe, just a few key touches here and there, and I think this becomes really of a juggernaut team to complement that defense.
I sent you CJ Stroud's passing chart after the game. and circle the left side,
Mm-hmm.
which it felt like a lot of his targets to the left were where a majority of the incompletions were, and very, very few completions. And I asked whether there was a story to be told over there. What do you think that story was? Because I went back and I looked at other CJ Stroud passing charts, and that wasn't a pattern. It wasn't like, oh, he's, can't go left, or that they're lining up a wide receiver over there consistently and that person just sucks. It felt to me like it might be a Chiefs defense story. And that's kind of why I ask in terms of moving forward for the next matchup.
Yeah, something that I'd be interested to see is just like the pressure that he was having to face. I mean, we saw Karlaftis really make a big difference, particularly down the stretch in this game. And when you're getting pushed from your left side, from your blind side, I think that's something that maybe sticks in your mind a little bit. All of a sudden you start drifting right, looking right, so forth and so on. But the Chiefs defense just has guys that come through over and over and over again. And one of those guys is always going to be Trent McDuffie.
Yeah.
So when you have a shutdown corner like that, and they've invested in him, they had L'Jarius Sneed, who prior to was their shutdown corner. They were like, we're just good with McDuffie as our guy. It's turned out really well for them.
We've talked this season about the Bills build and how it's different this year, and how it might have been by design different, and how it might be beneficial that it was different in terms of the wide receiver room. There are ways to look at that where you say, hey, if you don't have a wide receiver one, then it's harder for the defense to, know where to go and who to take away, because there really isn't someone to take away. Now you are just putting the ball in the hands of your very elite quarterback behind a line that will protect him, and you're having him distribute the ball to whatever's open, which is a little bit, in some ways, more complicated for a defense. Rather than having like a target earner out there, and the idea being just shut that guy down, and then it will get easier from there. I think it's interesting that we've got the Bills and the Chiefs together in the AFC Championship game based on everything I just said, because I feel like the Chiefs were kind of the first team to really sort of do that, right? Like they got rid of Tyreek Hill and went in a different direction, maybe for the same reason, maybe not for the same reason. But it's hard to deny that you don't have a wide receiver one. We never know on a week-to-week basis who is going to be the person, right, in the Chiefs offense. And I think it's kind of interesting that maybe those two types of offenses are the ones that are still standing in the AFC.
You say that, but man, Travis Kelce pulled it back out again. I mean, the guy is a magician. 8 targets, 7 receptions. He just seems open all the time. And I've spoken all year. The reason why I doubt the Bills so much is because I don't know if they can stop the pass. And it'll be really, really interesting to see if they can stop Travis Kelce this game. But overall, I pretty much agree with you. I mean, you look across the board, really the only person who was a high target earner was Xavier Worthy, and he's kind of their screen guy for the Chiefs. And it's very similar over there in Buffalo. It seems like the only known in either of these passing games is that Travis Kelce at some point is going to have 3 important catches. And other than that, like you said, it's really a toss-up. I'm not sure what to expect other than, them trying to hit Khalil Shakir deep down the field at some point and really crack the secondary of the Chiefs.
What do you make of that Travis Kelce thing, though?
Because I have no idea.
There's definitely a component of the Chiefs where you're like, okay, I know that they're not exciting. They will turn it on. And yet, can you really just turn it on? Maybe after so many years of experience. I mean, what's the 7th straight year that he's in the championship game for Patrick Mahomes? Maybe you do kind of figure out the rhythm of the season and how much you need to give. But then there's part of me that's like, you're playing every single game, and they're playing tight games this year. Mm-hmm. It's not like they were like, we can totally afford to just take our foot off the gas now. Like I can't imagine that they were in many situations where they actually felt that way. So I can't quite wrap my brain around the like, okay, now here it is. It's the playoffs. Now let's do it. I can't figure out how they're able to feel like that's what they do when that doesn't make any logical sense.
It doesn't. And, I think Mahomes only got sacked 3 times. Like that was the thing that I was like, okay, this is definitely no longer the same Chiefs, as Mahomes was getting sacked a lot. And we saw a lot of pressure be applied on him. What I make of the Kelce thing, I guess, is that there's some magical thing that happens in the playoffs where they just know what to do, or rather maybe they know how to break teams down at that point and evaluate their strengths and weaknesses. But at the same time, it seemed like it was the same thing as we've seen for almost the past decade now, where it's how is Kelce in the middle of the field with no one 9 yards in between him. And while it's no longer the catches that we see from Kelce where all of a sudden he's breaking for many yards after the catch, it's still first down after first down after first down and a touchdown in this game as well. And I was watching another podcast and Chris Long was saying that, he just practices and visualizes. And that reminded me a lot of Drew Brees and his ability to do it magically over the years as well. And I just think there comes a point in time in your career, I guess, where you really have seen it all. And I guess Travis Kelce is at that point in his career. And this is going to probably be the weakest defense that they have faced in the playoffs against the Bills. And so it'll be interesting to see how they attack it.
You think, are you thinking that we're going to see another big Travis Kelce game this weekend?
I'm not betting against it, is what I'm saying, because at this point I just come to believe it. And I think probably the best defensive team, I'm like doing a quick mental log, that they've ever played was probably the Ravens last year. I mean, that defense was like generationally good in terms of some of the metrics, and the way that they approached the game was designed to stop the Kansas City Chiefs. And it was like the first quarter and he was shredding them. And so I don't, of course, yes, I definitely think he's going to do it because he's done it so many times over and over and over again.
It's so wild. Looking at this box score, Xavier Worthy was the only wide receiver on the Chiefs that had a catch. Hollywood Brown, 0 for 2. D-Hop, 0 for 1. Juju, 0 for 1. That's it. It's Xavier Worthy.
Great.
The only wide receiver with a catch.
Right.
That's crazy. And then you have Travis Kelce with 7. And then you have Noah Gray with 3. So your tight ends have 10 catches on 11 targets. And then you've got Kareem Hunt and Isaiah Pacheco mixed in there also. Actually, Isaiah didn't have a catch. He just had a target.
Right.
So that's it. Four players that had catches. So you're pretty much the entire passing game here. Went through Travis and Xavier Worthy with a tiny bit of Noah Gray mixed in.
Right.
It's such an interesting recipe.
Well, and I remember way back in the offseason, I was talking about how, I really loved how they tried to rebuild this offense. And typically, across basketball or baseball, when people go on these long runs, they're doing it in different ways. And Tom Brady obviously did it in all kinds of different ways. But the formula has been pretty similar for the Chiefs. They're going to have a successful running game that may not be, the big play type, but they get you what you need on a play-by-play basis. And then it's going to be Kelce and Mahomes. And that's been the formula for years now. And it looks exactly the same as it did look 4 years ago of the way that they're attacking teams, especially down in the playoffs.
We talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we were getting ready for week 16 on the podcast. We talked about the Chiefs and the fact that I think people just write them off too easily because the advanced metrics don't look that sexy. And so they're sort of middle of the pack in like everything. But that doesn't necessarily, I think, in their case, tell the story of what they do. I mean, first of all, there was a lot of talk about situational. I mean, okay, let's take the ref conversation out of it because clearly the majority of the conversation was about refs. So forgetting that for a second, and I realized that there are a lot of people out there that are like, we can't, but separate conversation. The situational football, they've obviously got down pat. Right. Like this is a team that just absolutely maximizes, like they win at the margins, right? All of those like little things add up for them in each game and then over a period of time. But also, like you pointed out a few weeks ago when we talked about this, they're a team that just does what they need to do on each down to get themselves into 3rd and short. Right. So there's nothing from an EPA standpoint that is going to be particularly crazy because they're not breaking all these explosive plays and they're not even in a position to have to. Like you're not like in a 3rd and 14 or something like that where you have to hit a big play. You're like 3rd and 1, so the stats at the end of the game just don't end up looking really that exciting,
right?
But they're just staying ahead of the sticks. They're just doing what they need to do in order to win the game, get in the end zone.
They have been more successful than explosive.
Yeah.
Consistently.
Yep.
This year. One thing I will note with regard to the situations that will be something to note, particularly because the Chiefs will be at home for this game, is that Andy Reid has been typically more conservative in the early quarters on 3rd and 4th down than you'd like to see from an analytical.
He's no Dan Quinn, Dan Campbell.
No. And by the way, we were like joking around and we had an over-under of how many 4th downs. I don't think the Lions actually even needed any 4th downs in that game, but I think there was like 4 to 5 or 6 that the Commanders went for it on 4th down alone. And I was like, this is just beautiful to watch. And you're not necessarily going to see that type of approach from Andy Reid, but Sean McDermott has been aggressive over the years. He's been a guy who I think gets very overlooked and underrated as a head coach. And I was looking down as we were going through all the interviews and the interview processes for the head coaches and who could go where and who's done really well this year. And I think Sean McDermott is growing into a coach who, no matter who's on the team, and of course you got to chalk some of this up to Josh Allen as well, but he is going to put you in a standpoint where you can compete and you can at least be in the playoffs, if not make a run in the playoffs. I think we've seen enough from him at that point. I think he's going to be aggressive, substantially more aggressive than Andy Reid will be on 3rd and 4th down. And I'm going to be interested if the margins start becoming thin, if that makes a real difference in this game.
Well, the game is, not that this matters, but the line is 1.5. Mm-hmm. So in comparison to the other game, which is a 6.5 point spread, Eagles big favorites at home in that game. This is one that at least Vegas thinks is going to be close. I think all the rest of us probably can agree on that. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, that if we do see a 4th down or an opportunity to go for it or kick a field goal, take the points, what will these two teams do? And you seem to think that McDermott might be more likely of the two to take the aggressive approach.
Yeah. And what's weird about it too, is we've seen Mahomes convert so many critical, even in the Super Bowl last year, he converted a critical 4th down. So it's not that Reid is not going to do it. It's just, I wonder if there can be a buildup of it in the 1st and 2nd quarter that makes this, a come from behind situation for the Chiefs that would probably not occur, when you're on the 20 or the 35, and Andy Reid's probably going to be more likely to go for 3.
So that's the AFC game here. One other small thing that I was looking at, because, we do a fantasy contest, and I was also kind of looking for props, like other people to just sort of put on our radar and how this game might play out. One of the things that has come up is the Bills and the number of receiving yards that they give up to running backs. I just want to get your thoughts on this. They gave up the most receiving yards to running backs during the regular season. They gave up the 2nd most receptions. So obviously it's not just a few big ones. It's a point of emphasis for the teams that are scouting them and saying, how can we beat them? They clearly think that there's a way to beat them by throwing to the running backs, right? So that did not happen in this past game, because that was something that I think some people were looking for from Justice Hill maybe might get involved in the passing game. And that was something that he did in the first meeting. I think he was the leading receiver, if memory serves me correctly, in the first meeting. So that didn't happen this time. Looking at the Chiefs and how they might approach that particular situation and whether or not they might throw to the running backs, they're an interesting team to look at in that sense, because they don't really do that much. It's not like the guy, every once in a while, but it's not like they usually have running backs that are, their leading receivers. Samaje Perine is the one who, if there is one who tends to lead in receiving yards amongst the running backs, it's typically him. He didn't have a catch this past week. That's the Texans. It's a different matchup. Do you think that there's any chance that Samaje Perine plays a role in this game, or that maybe we see a little bit more? We keep waiting for the Isaiah Pacheco thing to kick in. And there was some talk going into this game about like maybe now it is, like we've been waiting for weeks and we haven't seen the Isaiah Pacheco that we thought we were going to see coming off of injury. And maybe now we'll see it in the playoffs. And then that kind of didn't happen against the Texans. That might just be because it's the Texans. What's your anticipation about the running backs for the Chiefs and how they might be incorporated here?
So there's a couple items here that trickle down, but the thing that I've pretty much always identified with the Buffalo Bills defensively is their willingness to have, light linebacker play. So like they're comfortable with keeping Taron Johnson as, kind of an every down guy at the nickel corner position, slot corner position, and then playing Matt Milano. And even when Matt Milano was out, it was basically Dorian Williams and they throw some other guys in as well. But they're basically going to consistently play one linebacker. The interesting thing to note, as you noted, is like typically at that stage, you're probably going to give up more to running backs because it's clear that you're worried about the wide receivers, so forth and so on. The Chiefs more generally at the running back position have just kind of fallen off in production from midseason. Early on in the year, they were immensely successful in the run game. And I think they've settled around, the 10 spot ranking wise in terms of their effectiveness rushing. And I'd expected Pacheco to just jump back, as you said.
Yep.
And we have not seen it at all. Kareem Hunt by far has been their most productive runner. And again, down the stretch, he took kind of a downturn. So I think this is going to play out very similar to the way the Ravens did, because the Ravens, I think, are 5th in 12 personnel usage, and the Chiefs, I think, are 2nd. Noah Gray is going to be on the field, and Travis Kelce is also going to be on the field. And so what I'm really interested in is less so, and of course, in the league you're talking about, I burned Noah Gray last week, which now that I'm thinking about it, probably shouldn't have done that. But now I have Travis Kelce to use. I'd actually be looking for Noah Gray to break out as kind of the secondary passing option in this game, maybe matched up against a linebacker who he can kind of get over on. And we've also seen him play important parts in these championship runs in past years in exact spots like this down the stretch where, you are going to be facing a little lighter defensive build. They're probably going to be focused on Kelce a lot. You want to be in those 12 personnel positions so that you can run the ball and be successful in the running game. What does that open up? Probably the second tight end. I'd be more looking at Noah Gray than necessarily Pacheco or Hunt or Pirine in this game.
That makes sense. Same space of the field, and there are a lot of teams out there that just aren't built to take advantage of that with their tight ends, so they would throw to the running back. So that all makes sense. Good stuff. Looking at the NFC, we've got a Washington, Philadelphia NFC.
I'm really excited for this game. Really excited for this game.
Is it because you're excited about sort of the unknowns attached to Washington? Is that what makes it so exciting for you, or what is it about that?
This is the one game, maybe all year, where the biggest weakness of a team is the biggest weakness of the other team. Like, pretty much everyone has taken advantage of the Commanders' passing defense this year, and the biggest weakness of the Eagles right now is their passing offense. Okay. And so it's in this weird position where you're like, is there going to be frustration? Are they not going to be able to take advantage of that? We saw the Lions be able to run very effectively against the Commanders in the past game. But if Jaden Daniels starts getting hot and, Quinyon Mitchell got a little banged up, it seems like he's going to play this game. We've seen people at time to time be successful against this Eagles defense, Jaden Daniels, namely late in the season. And this starts becoming a track meet, as it kind of did against the Lions. And I'm really worried about the Eagles passing game being able to stand up in a track meet style game. But the easiest way to get out of a track meet style game is just to hold the ball. And no team is positioned better to just hold the ball and run the ball than the Philadelphia Eagles.
I think that this matchup is really, really interesting for a number of different reasons. What you just said there, which would be interesting to see if we can get AJ Brown unlocked.
Yeah.
The fact that they are where they are, and he has 3 catches on 10 targets for I think 24 yards in the postseason is crazy. Like if we'd said, week 18, here's going to be a stat line through in the postseason. What do you think? would you have been like, yeah, that could probably lead to a win? It just feels like not what you want to get out of your wide receiver one, right? But I guess if there's a team that can still advance in spite of that, and obviously the weather was a factor in this past game, much like we described with Baltimore Buffalo. But wild that AJ Brown has really been unable to contribute in the ways that they would like for that to happen. Interesting that he might be able to this week because of the matchup. But also, I just think more than anything, the fact that Washington's offense specifically has just changed so much over the course of the season puts an unknown component attached to them that I really don't know in a lot of ways what I'm going to see, how successful what I'm going to see will be, because they just keep evolving. Like, everybody who follows me knows that I spent the first half of the season yelling about Terry McLaurin being locked down at the left wide receiver spot, right? In the first few weeks, it was like an 85% clip or whatever. He's just like, you know exactly where he's going to be. And I was frustrated about that, though, understanding the ways in which that worked for that specific offense and why that was. Now that's not the case anymore. Now we're down to like, you know, since the bye, that's pretty much changed. And you're looking at him over there more like, let's see, it was 59% in week 15, 60% in week 16, 65% in week 17. So again, he is moving around more frequently, but that's not the only alteration that we're seeing. What are the biggest ways that you think that this offense has changed as the season's gone on?
Cliff Kingsbury comes from the Mike Leach tree. He's a Texas Tech guy, a Texas college, came Texas Tech, Texas A&M, you know, all throughout that. You'd expect him to play with a lot of light personnel, spreading the ball around, and there is a lot of that. But what this offense has really turned into is you're going to see 2 and 3 tight ends on the field, and they're going to run gap scheme runs at you and really try to pound you up front to try to open up some of the screen games on the outside, and then also to allow Jaden Daniels to go pretty much supernova at any given point in the game. That's kind of their formula. Is Brian Robinson's a really physical back. They have some really physical interior offensive linemen in Allegretti, Sam Cosmi, and Biotish. They're going to get those guys moving. They're going to try to throw some misdirection at you in the motion game, and you're going to have to tackle Brian Robinson with 2 guys basically in front of you. That's been their formula in the running game, which you would not necessarily expect from an air raid guy. And then secondarily, which we really saw in this game against the Lions, where they were doing this thing where they were really tightly bunching 3 wide receivers far away. And this is an air raid thing. And in particular, you know, Josh Heupel, who was at UCF, he's now at Tennessee, loves to do this. And they're going to kind of run this nouveau triple option where, you know, Daniels isn't necessarily in the read, but it's more like kind of a hand or pitch thing, but he's going to roll out on it. And we saw them basically score a touchdown on that against the Lions. And I'm going to be really interested to see how they utilize that as well. The final element, which is more of a personal element, but I struggle to not chalk this up to Cliff because we didn't see this while Jaden Daniels was at LSU, but he's become a lot more careful runner, a lot more in that Lamar Jackson vein of, you know, he's going to get down. He's not going to take big hits. He took 1 big hit along the sidelines where he was trying to get out of bounds. So I don't really know but that was the first one, I think maybe all year that he's taken. He was taking those 1 or 2 times a game at LSU. And frankly, it's pretty frustrating for me who loves Jaden Daniels and wants him to, you know, hit 5th gear and hit 90 miles per hour and streak down the field like he did against Alabama last year. But he's not going to take chances and he's not going to be risky with the ball in the run game. And I'm assuming that was a decision made by Dan Quinn, by Cliff, and by Jaden Daniels that get the yardage you can, get down, live to fight another day. You're a good enough passer to take advantage of it at that point. And that's basically what he's done all year.
He's notably calm looking on the field, like on the sideline, waiting for his turn to get back on the field. I find myself just like every time they go to a shot of him, just like Like, what's happening? What am I looking at right now? Not like he's gonna look frazzled or anything like that. I don't know what I'm expecting him to look like, but he looks so chill in a way that just feels like, how is he able to do this as a rookie in this first season? Are there any things that you have seen where I think early in the season, it's kind of like, okay, they're doing this air raid thing where they move really fast. He knows where everyone's going to be. There's not a lot of thinking in that sense. There's like a lower ADOT that we're working in here. Like you can kind of see the ways that they're almost like easing. I think smartly, by the way. I don't think that any of this is a knock against any rookie quarterback. I think these are things that should have been done for Caleb. So they're, but you could see the ways that they were maybe like, okay, let's give him a little bit here. Okay, now we can have a little bit more. Have you seen anything that you think he has yet to prove or they have yet to put on his plate? Are there any questions in that sense about like what he can do if they asked him to do it?
I mean, I think at this point, it's kind of just more personal preference because they do still run a lot of no huddle and they were doing a lot of that in the Lions game as well. But it's clear that he has control of the tempo, which is something you want to be able to do both, right? And it's clear that he is under control when that tempo hits. And it was able to make a pretty big difference against the Lions. And they were able to get some plays that maybe they wouldn't have been able to get in using that tempo. Just like thinking it through, the accuracy has been there, the decision making has been there. Obviously the running has been there. It's going to be interesting to see how he faces some middle pressure against Jalen Carter and Ojomo and Milton Williams from the Eagles. They've been fantastic at that all year. I don't think he's really had to face that yet in a primo moment. The Lions are decimated at the defensive tackle position. None of their guys really had top metrics in this game in the pass rush. They got gashed all game as well. And so I think less of something to prove and less of something that I really want to get done if I'm the Eagles is try to, force some middle pressure. Then you have a guy like Zach Bond and you have a guy like Nolan Smith, who has kind of come up in recent weeks, kind of, press the edge a little bit and try to box him in and try to make him make throws. Maybe the old not sack avoidant Jaden Daniels could come out in that situation, but he's proven a lot in these last few games.
Yeah, he really has. You've mentioned some pretty impressive names on the Eagles defense. I think that's when I watch them, I'm just constantly like, God, that guy's so good. And that guy's so good too. And that guy's so good too. Like the roster, the Eagles roster top to bottom just feels
it's very good.
Insane. And I mean, we've done, our Pro Bowl voting here at Sumer and we did our all pro conversations. Like the number of times that Eagles players came up for those conversations is just wild. And then players who are like just right outside the cusp of those conversations. Like Quinyon Mitchell is so good, and this is first season. Like just watching his development is just crazy. It's wild. Nakobe Dean not being on the field felt like it maybe affected a few things positively for the Rams, negatively for the Eagles. How do you think him not being on the field maybe plays into this one?
Given that they love using tight ends, it could make a pretty big difference. And, being a former linebacker, anytime you're trying to fit up those gap scheme runs, it kind of takes the defensive lineman out at other than the point of attack. I think it could, make a pretty big difference. We haven't seen the Washington run game get as much off the ground as we saw it in the very early season. And I think the defensive tackles are going to eat up a lot of that stuff, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you're looking at it as a fan, for the Commanders. But I'm also really interested in how they're going to manage Jaden Daniels as kind of a supernova rushing third down, fourth down converter with his legs. I think Zach Bond has been their coverage guy all year, and he's been excellent at it. And typically you want to have another guy that you keep in the box. That could be a major question mark on third and fourth down in this game.
Both games for the Commanders against Philadelphia this season were in their bottom 3 of the year for EPA per play, and they were their 2 worst games in terms of rush EPA.
Right.
So, I mean, the Nakobe Dean loss, as mentioned, maybe has an impact on that. Maybe helps the Commanders' offense to a degree. Eckler was their leading receiver in the first meeting.
Yep.
With 89 yards. He didn't play in week 16. So, do you think they go back to that?
I think they're going to get all their guys involved. The comeuppance of Dyami Brown has reshaped
so big.
Yeah,
right.
how they're gonna attack this, and I think, especially given that, you think Darius Slay may have some juice. Matthew Stafford clearly thought that he could go after Darius Slay, and I'm questioning if they don't truly believe in Dyami Brown, if that may end up being the game plan from the Commanders, is just trying to get, Slay involved a little bit more, trying to keep it away from their strength in the middle of the field. Like you said, the Eagles have a ton of good players, and it's hard to game plan when there's so many good guys. And so I wonder if, the elite tackling ability of their nickel, DeJean, and of Bond as well, doesn't make this less of a game for Eckler. But given their susceptibility to getting a little weird in personnel and, bringing out a lot of 2 running back packages, which they also did a lot against the Lions, it could be that he gets involved. I just don't think this is the matchup per se for him to get involved a ton outside of, their general run game and pass concepts.
In week 16, when they played each other, this was the game that Jalen Hurts got hurt and left.
Right.
And we saw a lot of Kenny Pickett. And I think that there's kind of 2 ways of looking at that game. The Commanders won the game. It was close. There was they won it, they were going to win it, or they wouldn't have won it had Jalen Hurts been healthy. And I think that I was probably in the latter camp. I think that Jalen Hurts makes enough of a difference and changes the offense enough in comparison to Kenny Pickett, that the way that it ended up being close probably tilts the scales towards Philadelphia. Now we're looking at, coincidentally, Jalen Hurts being kind of a question mark this week in terms of we're going to monitor his injury all week long, and we don't know how effective he's going to be able to be. Do you have concerns about him looking like himself in this game enough that that he's able to do what they need him to do?
The concerns in the passing game are real, and they have grown as the year has gone on. So I'll note that. But that's not what's going to kill this Commanders team, in my opinion. What would kill them from Jalen Hurts is if he gets going in the running game, particularly if he's able to escape pressure. Yeah. That was really what was getting over on the Commanders' defense in that late season game. And that very well could be the difference. And here's why. I've tracked this all year. Bobby Wagner's a great player. I think he ended up being on a Pro Bowl list, all pro, whatever. But Luvu and Wagner in particular are both kind of hammerhead linebackers when it comes down to it. And I've noticed that particularly in the second halves of games, they tend to kind of trail off. And we really saw that last week with Jahmyr Gibbs running like a wild man pretty much on every single play. And it's going to be the exact same thing from Saquon Barkley. Yeah. And it's going to be the exact same thing from the Eagles offensive line. You add in Jalen Hurts also as a part of that improv running game on dropbacks, that could be a real killer for the Commanders.
Yeah. Are you worried about Jalen, or do you think that he probably, I mean, there's no way to know, but like just based on what we know at this moment about his injury, which is not much.
I mean, I'm just worried about the performance, period. It's not looking good. I mean, the leading receiver is Dallas Goedert. Saquon Barkley was next. When you have 2 elite receivers that you're spending a lot of money on, you need to get them the ball. And so, like, if you're looking long term, is this a thing you can just chalk up to injury again after it happening 2 times in a row? I wouldn't be shocked if, late day 2, they kind of do the same thing that they did with Carson Wentz and try to pick up a guy that maybe they like in round 3 or round 4 or something like that, day 3. But I don't know how you can keep on going with the passing offense, the most important position in football, being your biggest weakness as a team.
Yeah, that feels problematic. Yeah, just in general.
Especially when you can, get to a Super Bowl, get to conference championship games without the quarterback playing well, or the quarterback just being totally injured, or playing your second and third string quarterbacks. Like it's at that point you could pinpoint that's the thing that's limiting you. And it's very rare that you can do that as a team.
Looking at the two teams that were eliminated this week, the Rams and the Lions. Let's hit the Rams first. I think that this is a team. Well, I think they're really interesting in the sense that the defense just got dramatically better as the season went on. Like, I love these young players on this defense. I mean, Jared Verse talked the talk and then kind of backed it up, right? Like, he came to play. Like, I was wondering, I was like, I'm not an Eagles fan. If somebody said this specifically about the team that I had allegiance to, would I feel differently than I do? Because I was just kind of like, I don't know, like, go for it, Jared. Like, now go back yourself up. You know what I mean? Like, I felt like, just as a storyteller and somebody who just wants to enjoy the game from all of the different levels, I was like, oh, that's a fun little added layer for us. If I was an Eagles fan, I might feel differently about that. But the defense, I think, is awesome. And there are maybe some like small tweaks that you can make, but I think they're moving in the right direction. They're so good at identifying people. Cooper Kupp feels like a big question in terms of what to do with him, because we just didn't see him at all at the end of the year.
I think obviously the most uncontrollable is Stafford says he's going to go and evaluate his future. And I think if Stafford stays, Kupp probably stays as well. He does have, I think, 2 years remaining on his contract. You're pretty locked in there. And it feels like what they need him to do at this point is to be a 1 or 2 big catch a game guy. But is there value elsewhere? Like, I just can't see McVay and Leslie moving Kupp at this point. But that's definitely the biggest question. And luckily, they've been so good at drafting on the defensive side of the ball and kind of rebuilt the offensive line. I think that's a little concern as well. I think they're losing the left tackle, Eric Jackson, to free agency, though they may bring him back as well. You're really in a standpoint of, like, how do we bolster this offense right now to be a little bit more consistent if Matthew Stafford's going to stay? And then if Matthew Stafford ends up retiring, then you have a lot more questions. But I don't know if that's – I don't know what the probability of that happening. It seems.
Let me ask you this about Cooper Kupp. What does our all-in grading tell us about whether or not he's still the same player?
So
or not.
In terms of receiving this year, he was just slightly above average. Like, you're not getting Kupp 2,000 yard anymore. Maybe you can get Kupp 600 yard or Kupp 700 yard. The load will have to be lighter, and the target load, and more primarily the production load, you can't expect to be, wide receiver 1A and wide receiver 1B as you could maybe 2 seasons ago last season.
Some big decisions to be made on the offensive side of the ball there. What about the Lions? What about the Lions and what they, I mean, the coordinators, clearly we know Ben Johnson leaving, maybe Aaron Glenn leaving. It looks like we're kind of moving in that direction. Probably there's still so many head coaching vacancies out there, and he seems to be among the favorites. So there's a strong likelihood that they're replacing both of them. There's that component. And then there is, in addition to that, like what all of the roster decisions are that they can make. And I love that you identified edge. We already talked earlier in the season where we, Thomas and I got enamored with the idea of Max Crosby going there, even though we knew it wasn't going to happen, but like what that would look like and what that could mean for this team. Obviously they get the injured players back, right? And so there's like, and they got all of these players just from a depth standpoint, so much experience. Like, I almost feel like this season they could be better for it in terms of just the roster in a lot of different ways, but will they be able to put it all together again? Who knows?
Yeah. The first point will be effectively replacing 2 of the best coordinators in the league. I think they're uniquely positioned to make, like, the Baltimore Ravens are known for, promoting people internally. I think they're uniquely in a place where everyone even wants their down coaching staff guys. I think Tanner Inkstein is like the number one guy. He comes from a Harbaugh tree, was at University of San Diego for a long time. He's their passing game coordinator. I think he probably slots in to the offensive coordinator spot. Hank Fraley, their offensive line coach, is also getting interviews. And then Scotty Montgomery, who I actually faced when I played in college. He was the head coach at ECU. He's now their assistant head coach and running backs coach. He's come up as well. When you have 3 candidates for your offensive coordinator position on your staff, you're in a pretty good spot. And it's the same way on the defensive side of the ball. Kelvin Shepard, LSU legend, Hard Knocks legend as well. When they did the Lions a couple years ago, he feels good. And then Deshae Townsend is also getting job requests from across the league. He interviewed with the Niners passing game coordinator. That's 5 guys just internally that could not only take their offensive coordinator, defense coordinator position, but other ones across the league. So I'm feeling like they're probably going to go internal there. And really their only hole, as you mentioned, it's depth on defense. I think particularly at the cornerback position, which they've invested a lot in. They traded for Carlton Davis. They've drafted Ennis Rakestraw and Terrion Arnold. Amik Robinson was also pretty good. Like, you look across the aggregate of the season, a lot of those younger guys were not very good. Carlton Davis was elite. I wonder if, like you said, the experience does make a difference. They trot out with those 3 guys and then keep moving forward from there.
Were you sad to see them go?
Very, very sad, but very happy to see. It was really like, not only was it the best game of the weekend, but it was also like sad to see golf not play super well, but it was very high level of play, particularly in the first half. Jaden Daniels looked awesome. Sad to see them go. I'm hoping there's no drop off next year. It doesn't seem like there will be, given they're bringing pretty much everyone back on offense, except for maybe Kevin Zeitler. But I like how Christian Mahogany has played in spot duty there. And so it feels like it's going to be the same lines next year. We'll see.
Yeah. I mean, me being sad about the Lions being eliminated literally has nothing to do with not wanting the Commanders to be there, or not being happy for the Commanders, or not seeing all of the things that all of the Commanders fans have gone through over the years. And the fact that they're like, I mean, fully get it. It's just that the Lions have built this for the last few years, right? In such a way that it's so easy to get on board, and kind of like, as somebody who has no allegiances to Detroit whatsoever. And also when they hired Dan Campbell, wasn't necessarily like the first to be like, this is going to work. Like when he's talking about biting kneecaps, I wasn't like the full buy-in person. But then the second that they hit the field that first year, I was like, oh, I see what he's doing. And I like it very much. And so it's just a bummer that all of the success kind of felt like it was pointing to this season, and then they weren't able to do anything with it. That's, I think, the part that I think is so disappointing. But we'll see if they can come back next year. And we will be back next week with 2 teams to focus on. 2 teams to discuss what they need to do in the offseason, and also we'll be turning the page towards a lot of our offseason content, honestly, as we get ready to head to Senior Bowl, Shrine prior to that. We're going to have a lot of draft content coming up here and on the Draft FM podcast, which you can find on whatever podcast platform you get your podcasts on. For Sam Bruchhaus, I'm Lindsay Rhodes. Thanks so much for being with us today.